This is day 2 of our series. The title for the presentation this evening is The Mark of the Beast. In fact, I think we could call this The Mark of the Beast Part 1, because tomorrow evening we're going to continue with this presentation, and also we're going to be looking at the seal of God, the counterpoint to the mark of the beast. But for this evening, if you have your Bibles with you, I'm going to ask you to open them and go to the book of Revelation, chapter 14 and verse 9. And here is a very familiar passage, the third of the 3 angels' messages, where it says, "The third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb." Now, when we're looking at the 7 last plagues, indeed, this is what we're looking at, the wrath of God, which is going to be poured out without mixture, without anything that will hold back. Previously, when God has punished the world, he's held back. But at the end of time, the full punishment will come out. So it's a warning that the flames of hellfire await those who worship the beast and accept its mark. And once again, as we said yesterday, this whole great controversy that's going on this planet revolves around worship. Who will you worship at the end of time? And it is a loving God that gives such urgent warnings because of his immense care for us. He loves us so much that he doesn't want that anyone should be lost. So we are going to be lost only if we choose to be lost. Now, in Revelation chapter 12, here we have the story of the woman, this woman representing God's church. And in verse 14, we're told that this woman would be given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time, a times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. Now, what's happening here? In Revelation chapter 12, we've got the story of the persecution of God's church that takes place for a certain amount of time. She goes into the wilderness. There in verse 14, we're told that she will be there for a time, a times, and half a time. If we go back a few verses, go back to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6, you will see the same thing is said there, that the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, or 60 days, as it says. Now, this is a time frame that's repeated twice in the book of Revelation. It's the time frame of persecution, and in fact in Revelation 13, as we will see later, the same time frame is actually given, because if you go to Revelation 13 and verse 5, it talks about 42 months that the beast will be persecuting God's people. So Revelation 12 talks about it from the point of view of God's people. They go into the wilderness, those who are being persecuted. Revelation 13 talks about it from the other viewpoint. It describes the length of time during which the beast will persecute the saints, or God's people. Now, according to the Jewish calendar, the year consisted of 360 days. It was divided up into 12 months. Each month represented 30 days. And so you can see that if we talk about 42 months, for example, as it does in Revelation 13:5, actually it's talking about 1,260 days. When we talk about the 1,260 days as times, we are told that it's a time, a times, and a half a time. And we will see that that actually works out to be 3.5 years. 3.5 years, if we bring that into days, surprise, surprise, we find out it comes to 1,260 days. So there is one time frame that is being repeated over and over again. Now, what does this actually mean? Does it mean that God's people, the church, is going to be persecuted for 1,260 days? Well, no, that's sadly, that's too short a time. The persecution goes on for a lot longer than that. So we've got a further stage to go to understand this time prophecy. We go to Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6. There it says, and here is God talking to Ezekiel, saying, when you have accomplished what I'm telling you to do, lie again on your right side. So he tells Ezekiel, first of all, lie on your left side, then lie on your right side. You will bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed you each day for a year. Now, here is a biblical principle. In prophecy, when we see days being spoken of, God says, I've appointed you a day for a year. Now, the Bible actually says that you shouldn't take anything from the mouth of one witness. You should take it from the mouth of 2 or more witnesses. So we're going to look for a second witness. The second witness we find in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 34. Here, this is God's punishment to the children of Israel for not having the faith to go into the promised land. And here God says, after the number of days in which you searched out the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities. Even 40 years you will know my breach of promise. And this is where God took the children of Israel and said, right, you went in 40 days. Now I'm going to send you to go back around the mountain for 40 years before you come again to the promised land to enter into it. So here we're given the principle to use in interpreting days in prophecy, a day for a year. And so now if we look at the time frame we've been looking at, our 1,260 days becomes 1,260 years. The 42 months, or 3.5 years, or 1,260 days becomes 1,260 years. So persecution doesn't last for 3.5 years. Persecution actually lasts for 1,260 years. Now, the good news is that this time has passed, and we're going to look into history now, and we're going to see how the time has passed. Now, when we look into history, you will of course recall that when we look at the Christian church, the Christian church was founded at a time when the Roman Empire was in control of the world, and with the Roman Empire being in control, there was persecution that came with it. And then thankfully persecution eased off because there was an emperor by the name of Constantine. Now Constantine, in the 4th century, he converted to Christianity. And so in 380 AD, Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. As I say, persecution eased off. It wasn't there anymore. Now, time goes on. Constantine decided to move the capital of the empire to a new city away from Rome. This was the city of Constantinople. Now, Constantinople, we call it today Istanbul. It's in Turkey, but this was where he moved the center of the empire to. Now, there was a difference between Constantinople and Rome. If I put it very bluntly, those who were in Rome were more of the passionate, warlike people, the generals that were ready to go out and conquer in the name of the empire. In Constantinople, you had a different way of thinking. These were more the philosophers, those who had taken on the Greek idea of thinking deeply about things. So when it came to religion, the center of religion became in Constantinople. However, the problem that the emperor had was that he wasn't able to control the whole of the empire. It was so vast that he said, okay, I'm going to control the east. And then in 533, so it's a couple of hundred years later, or 150 years later, a man by the name of Justinian was the emperor. And in 533 AD, he gave power to the Bishop of Rome. And what he said was, the Bishop of Rome, he's a learned man. And so because he is so learned, I'm going to give him the power to look after the western part of the empire. And in his Corpus Juris Civilis, this is Justinian's codex where he codified all the laws of the land. Rome was ruled by law that was the same wherever you were in the Roman Empire. It was the same law. And within this law, Justinian said, whatever the church forbids, we also will forbid. And he took the laws of the church, what we call the canons of the church, and made them part of Roman law. So he produced this book, and in fact the Catholic Encyclopedia tells us that the immortal Corpus Juris Civilis was produced, and as it says, it would be very difficult to exaggerate the importance of this corpus, because this is now the basis of all canon law or church law as well. Now, as I say, 533, Justinian says to the Bishop of Rome, okay, you're in charge of the Western Empire, now off you go and look after the Western Empire. The problem was that Rome was under siege. It was under siege by several powers. There was the Vandals that came along, and in fact by 535 the Vandals were overthrown, and then in 538 the Ostrogoths were overthrown as well. Now when the Ostrogoths were overthrown, this meant that the Roman bishop was now able to come out of Rome and exercise his authority. Here is Justinian saying that the Bishop of Rome, learned in ecclesiastical discipline, has preserved reverence. He has preserved reverence for the See of Rome and has subjected all things to its authority and has given it unity. And so 538, the Bishop Vigilius ascended the papal chair. He was protected by General Belisarius, but then he was able to go out and actually represent the Roman Empire. So 538, this decree of Justinian went out, and now the Bishop of Rome becomes the head of all the Christian churches in the Roman Empire. He was also known as the definer of doctrine and the corrector of heretics. Now the problem was that as soon as he was in that power, the Roman bishop then started to persecute anyone who was not following what he was teaching or what were the Roman doctrines. So we had this very serious time of persecution of the church by the church. And this began in 538, and you'll remember prophecy tells us that there's going to be a 1,260-year period. So if we count 1,260 years from that date of 538, we come up to the year 1798. So we've got Vigilius, the Bishop of Rome, exercising power until the time of Pope Pius VI. Now, what happened to Pope Pius VI? What happened in 1798? 1789, you get the French Revolution comes in. The revolutionaries start to take over the country of France. Now, why did this happen? Well, mainly it was because of Catholic doctrines that were being enforced in France caused a revolution amongst the people that were there. So the people rose up and they installed their own goddess. It was a prostitute who they took off the streets of Paris, and they took her into the Notre Dame Cathedral, and there they started worshipping her as the goddess of reason. Voltaire, who was alive at that time, he famously wrote that within one generation the Bible would be forgotten. Now, what we're looking at here is actually the account that you'll read in prophecy in Revelation chapter 11, where it talks about the two witnesses that were slain and their bodies lay on the street for 3.5 days, or in fact 3.5 years. This was the Old and New Testament that was trampled upon in France. But then in later years, the Bible would in fact come back. It would become the Protestant Bible rather than the Catholic Bible, and would be raised up higher than it was before. The room in which Voltaire sat when he said that within one generation the Bible would be eradicated, well, if you were to go there nowadays, or at least until very recently, that room has actually been used as a place where Bibles were stored. So it was really, God looked at what Voltaire said and he said, no, I'm in control here. So when we get to 1797, is actually what we're going to talk about, because the French Directory, they turned to their general, Napoleon Bonaparte, and they said, the papacy is oppressing the people. We need you to march on Rome and to go and take the Pope of Rome off the throne. We want him deposed. And so off he went. Napoleon Bonaparte went there to Rome, but when he got there, instead of destroying the papal government on his own responsibility, he decided to disregard the instructions that he was given, and he concluded with the Pope the Peace of Talentino, and this happened on the 19th of February 1797. Now, you may remember we looked at the dates. What were the dates that we looked at? Well, let's just go back very quickly and remind ourselves. There are the dates from 538 to 1798. But as I just told you, Napoleon concluded the Peace of Talentino in 1797. He then went back to France and he told the French Directorate, he said, well, I've concluded this peace. And the Directorate said to him, well, that's not what we asked you to do. We told you to go and take the Pope off his throne. So they then sent out General Berthier. General Berthier went to go to Italy. By now it was getting to the end of 1797. Unfortunately, he was not able to cross the Alps with his army because of the heavy winter. And so he wintered on the other side of the Alps, and then as the snow began to thaw in February of 1798, he crossed the Alps, he marched all the way down to Rome, and there he took the Pope prisoner. Now, in fact, we have a report of this from the 12th of March. The Times, the London Times, reported that when the people of Rome came out to meet General Berthier, they presented him with a crown of olives. But in accepting it, he said that it belonged to General Bonaparte, whose illustrious actions had prepared the liberty of Rome. In fact, they received him as a deliverer. He proclaimed the restoration of the Roman Republic. He made the Pope, Pius VI, a prisoner, stripped him of all his property, and removed him into France, where he was detained in captivity. When did he do this? Well, exactly as prophecy predicted. In 1798, exactly 1,260 years after the papacy had gained its power, after this time when it had been persecuting the Protestant churches, the Protestant Reformation had come up in the beginning of the 16th century. There were other places where reformers, as they would later be called, had arisen. They had all been persecuted. Many had been burnt at the stake. Many had been tortured. But now Napoleon and Berthier went to Italy, and there they took the papacy from its throne. It was a fulfillment of Revelation 13 and verse 3, where it says, "And I saw one of his heads," this is one of the heads of the first beast that comes up in Revelation 13, "as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and the world wondered after the beast." Now you'll notice the second clause there was that the deadly wound was healed. In fact, for 131 years, the power of the papacy was severely diminished. It had no claim to being a secular state. It was reduced only to an ecclesiastical power. At one point, there was more than one pope claiming to be the head of the church. Pius VI, he went into exile and he refused to come out of the palace where he'd been incarcerated. And then in 1929, the papacy regained control of the Vatican State, 12th of February. So it was almost exactly 131 years later, the Lateran Treaty was signed. Now the signing took place with Mussolini, who was the head of Italy at the time, and he signed it with Cardinal Gaspari, who signed on behalf of the Vatican. And even one of the newspapers at the time referred to the signing with these words. It said, "The Roman question tonight was a thing of the past, and the Vatican was at peace with Italy." It said, "In affixing the autographs to the memorable document healing the wound, extreme cordiality was displayed on both sides." Now you will notice that that expression was used there, healing the wound. It seems even the newspapers of the time realized what was going on. They were actually quoting from Revelation chapter 13, where it says his deadly wound was healed and all the world wondered after the beast. That's, of course, Revelation 13 and verse 3. Now, when we look at this, because you might wonder and say, okay, that's very interesting. We've looked at this length of time of what happened, but why actually are we looking at all of this? Well, we're coming up to the mark of the beast. And if we want to understand what is the mark of the beast, then perhaps what we need to do is to understand the counterpart to the mark of the beast, because a choice will be given for everyone to either accept the mark of the beast, or they will have the mark or the sign or the seal of God. So in the last few minutes of this presentation, we're just going to have a quick look at what we're talking about there. We'll turn to Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11 we're going to look at. Now, Exodus chapter 20, this is the fourth commandment. It's the Sabbath day commandment. I'm sure that you're very familiar with this commandment, where it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. And in verse 11 it says, For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested on the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Here we are looking at the longest commandment out of the 10 commandments. It's very specific in its instructions. In fact, if we just remind ourselves, let's just go back to the first part of that commandment. Notice that we are told 6 days you can do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. We're not told it's a 7th day. God has said very specifically the 7th day, and that's because in Genesis chapter 2, God said that on the 7th day he rested from all his works. Now, this word rested, sometimes it gives the wrong impression. God was not tired. The word that's translated there as rested, a better rendering of this word would be that God ceased on that day from all his work. So it became a day of ceasing. And this is what the idea, the concept of the Sabbath day has. When we look in the Hebrew language, for example, this idea of Shabbat, it's a time of ceasing. If you look in the Arabic language, you find that the 7th day is Yom el Sabd, and the word Sabd means to cease, to stop what you're doing. So God declared that 6 days there would be, you can work, you can do whatever you want to do, but the 7th day is the day that you rest from all your work. It has been hallowed by God. Now, what does that mean? It means it has been made holy. It's the only day that God actually made holy. He blessed that day and he hallowed it. Now, the Bible says that what God has blessed, nobody else can unbless. God himself says, the thing that goes out of my mouth, I don't change my mind. If I've said something, that's what I'm saying. And so God came to this 4th commandment and he said, I'm setting aside one particular day for you to rest on, and it's the 7th day of the week. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the beginning of that commandment, you will notice that the very first word on that commandment is remember. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, I find that rather interesting. When you look at the other 9 commandments, which of the other 9 commandments begins with the word remember? The first commandment says, I am the Lord thy God. There's no remembrance about that. In fact, it's a straight out statement. I am the Lord thy God. If you look at the very beginning of the Bible, the first few words, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, begins with, in the beginning, God. Throughout the entire Bible, there's never any question of whether there's a God or not. We start off with this very definitive, in the beginning, God. So with the first commandment, God is there. We're told in the second commandment, we're not supposed to bow down to any idols. Again, we're not told to remember not to bow down. We're not told to remember not to take the Lord's name in vain. And when we look at the other commandments, the last 6 commandments, all relating to how we relate to each other rather than relating to God, nowhere there are we told remember. We're not told to remember to honour our parents. You would have thought maybe that would be one where we should be remembering. Nowadays, as Christ predicted in one of his last discourses to his disciples, the love of many is waxing cold, children against parents, parents against children. Yet we don't find that commandment beginning with remember to honour your parents. We're not told remember not to murder. We're not told remember not to commit adultery. It's only the fourth commandment that begins with this phrase, remember. And we might consider, does that mean that this commandment, first of all, was so important that God needed to tell us to remember it? Secondly, is there a hint there that people would actually forget? That this commandment would be disregarded and something else would come in its place. Tomorrow evening, I want us to look at the other side of this presentation. We're going to see exactly what the mark of the beast is, and then we're going to see the opposite to that, the seal of God. Because, as I said, we are told that we have to make a choice between serving God or not serving God. The choice is going to come revolving around that fourth commandment, revolving around that commandment that says, remember. So, that's the end of the presentation for this evening. A quick look at history, a quick look at how the power of the Roman Catholic Church came up from the time of 538 AD through to 1798. Then there was that 131-year gap, and then we come into the restoration, the deadly wound being healed, as the papers of the day told us. It's an interesting story. It's a piece of history that we need to remember. And tomorrow night we will put the second part onto this and see why this is such an important thing.